How are you doing? Oh, now I don't hear you.
Hello, hello.
Oh, now I do hear you.
Uh-oh. I hope this doesn't, let's see. We'll just give it a shot. Let's
Yeah.
go. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah, I hear you now.
Very good. Hey, I really enjoyed our last conversation. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd come back and do it again.
Oh, good. And as you can see, I've used clips from it quite a bit. I thought you kind of distilled the motivation and energy behind this Jordan Peterson convergent in a particularly astute way. And so I've often thought about that as I've seen different people light up and get excited about Jordan Peterson. And then it's like, well, they're over here. Why? And then I go back to the comment that you had made. So I thought that was really very helpful.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to have you use that. And then the comments were a lot of fun. A lot of people chimed in, and I got some conversations about T.S. Eliot going, and that was fun. And so it was a good thing all around. This is the kind of thing I maybe have missed a little bit over the years, and it's something I wish I could engage in more. My life is very busy, so I can dip into the comment part of it and the kind of the back and forth part of it in a limited way, even though I can kind of keep up with the thread. Yeah. It's harder for me because you have to really, this is something it's interesting for you. You have to really be right on top of it because things are outdated in 3-4 days. Yeah. So I'm sure that's something you've noticed. It's one of the things you need to do is be right on top of it.
Yeah, but also as you said, part of the reason that the meetups have been so important, the local meetups that we've had here, is that we've really found a group of people who, like ourselves, really value meaningful conversation that talk about these issues. And there seem to be, it's difficult to find places and conversation partners for this at a sustained way. And so I think part of why our meetups have gotten traction is that we've sort of created a circle here who people know that, when we're having a meetup, they can come and they can talk, and it's been terrific.
And things are, it's a very interesting thing. You can be very comfortable with someone when you have this common sense. I told you last time that I was going to see Jonathan Pageau in Seattle. So my son and I went up there, and it's a room full of it's probably 70-80% Orthodox, lots of priests in the black garb, and we didn't necessarily fit under that part of it, but you could just spot someone who was there for the same reason that I was there, and you could just sit down with them, and it wouldn't be 10 or 15 seconds before you knew that you could have a conversation with that person, right, like we're having right now.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing, and I love that about the whole thing.
And it's very valuable. Because you don't find this often. And again, as the other Dr. Jim in my life, Dr. Jim Frazee, who teaches at community college here, I did a video with him early on. When I started doing the meetups, he attends a church in this area, and he said to me too, he said, we both felt this way. We've always longed to have a church have this aspect where we could engage with these ideas at this level, not just only within a church framework, but much more broadly. And that's what we've enjoyed. So it's tremendously helpful.
And I'll tell you, you've really knocked it out of the park for me in the last 3 weeks. You've had a number of posts that I've really found valuable. The one that you used my stuff on, where you ended up with Kierkegaard, that was just that kind of like threw me for a loop a little bit, because Fear and Trembling has always been right next to four quartets for me, as kind of like central, like back pocket books for me. And that you ended up with that kind of a analysis of Jordan Peterson. And it looked like you kind of enjoyed the fact that you got that idea nailed down. And at the end, you had this kind of grin on your face. And I think you really did. I think that was a nice nice job you did there. And so.
Well, let's talk a little bit about fear and trembling, because that has actually come up fairly regularly through many of my Jordan Peterson conversations. So why don't, for those who have never read it, why don't you talk a little bit about it and why you found it engaging?
Yeah. So what's going on in Fear and Trembling, and I'm going to take a little bit of an exception to the guy, what was his name, Tabernac, and the way he talked about it. He mentions that what we see in Fear and Trembling is Abraham having this angst, Abraham having this fear and trembling. But I really think the book works in a different way, actually, because the way it's set up is that we're kind of gazing onto Abraham as he's walking to the mountain there with Isaac. So this is the Binding of Isaac story, and you mentioned how Kierkegaard is often thought of as a trickster, and he uses this pseudonymous authorship to be this kind of obscure a little bit. But I think in this case he's using it for a different reason, because what he's trying to say there is that, at least as a starting point, we really can't identify with Abraham. And in order to emphasize that, he has this other character, Johannes de Silentio, who we ultimately find ourselves identifying with, because we gaze upon Abraham and we can't really kind of connect with him in a certain way. And there's a couple of reasons why that's the case. One, and maybe three, that I came up with here. One is that he's doing something that's insane, and we can't identify that with that. So in some fundamental way, killing your own child is kind of rubs against something that's very deep-seated that we really can't get past. And so we can't really identify with Abraham at that level. And then there's another level where we can't identify him with him, which is that he's doing something rationally, he's doing something irrational. And it's specifically irrational in that he's taking Isaac, who is the promised child. So we have to see Isaac as two things at once. Isaac is the promise of the future, and then he is also the sacrifice. And both of those characterizations of Isaac come from God. So if we take the story on its face value, both of those things are true. They're not things that are doubted. That is to say, we have to kind of say somehow that those two things are absolutely the case, and yet they're contradictory to each other. So he's violating the law of non-contradiction there, which is a rational law. We can't believe something and believe its opposite at the same time. So you can see there a kind of emotional basis with the killing of Isaac. We can't buy that. A rational basis, we can't buy that either. And so we can't identify, and this is the way that Fear and Trembling works, is a kind of musing in circles around the story, and he's cutting at it one way and he's talking about it another, and you're noticing that he's constantly, maybe partly coming back to this same point that we can't quite identify with Abraham, and yet he's doing this thing. And then there's a third way we can't identify with Abraham, and that is that to identify with him, we would have to not know the end of the story. And yet we do know the end of the story. So we can't know the end of the story and not know the end of the story at the same time. And so we really, in a way, are blocked. And then for me, there's this kind of Sixth Sense moment, if you remember the movie Sixth Sense, where there's this moment where you're just thrown into your own subjectivity in that movie, where you're like, oh my God, that's the way this worked out. He's dead. Well, in a way, for me, Fear and Trembling works this way, where there's this moment where you realize, I can't identify with Abraham. And then all of a sudden you realize, I can identify with Abraham because I am in the situation of Abraham. I don't know my future.
Right.
And in order for me to move forward, I have to sacrifice my future in a certain way. I have to choose one thing over another, and that means losing something and doing so with the hope of gaining something. And so we're kind of that's our existential situation. And I think that kind of notion of identifying with that moment that we actually are in this kind of situation of this paradox in our own very existence is the reason why the existentialists picked up on Kierkegaard, because it kind of encapsulates or embodies or shows us, if you will, that nature of our existence.
It's interesting. I forget what I was listening to or reading, but maybe it was my conversation with Bern Power. How do we regard Kierkegaard? So I read, I don't know his body of work well by any means. A number of years ago, I read a very fascinating biography on Kierkegaard, and that was really a good introduction for me in terms of the pseudonyms, the strangeness of this man's life.
Yes,
I mean, he led an exceedingly strange life, and he comes at a time he is part of a family, and I know this being part of a clergy family. There are clergy families where there are fathers and grandfathers and uncles who are clergy, and so the church becomes a family business in a way. And this is at a time, this is in a sense peak Christendom in some ways, because this is a golden age for Denmark. The church is you're at this point in a sense where it's felt at that point that you've arrived at a final cohesion of science and religion, that the world is fit together, that everything is as it should be. And Kierkegaard comes through and just says, this is not Christianity at all. And so everyone is like, what? But yet he's a fabulously popular author, and everybody's sort of following in him at one, and in some senses mystified by him, but in other senses horrified by him. And he's a strange little man who, in some ways, if you listen to Jordan Peterson talking about himself when he was younger, and Kierkegaard was kind of a smarter than everybody else, very quick wit, sharp tongue, ready to cut anybody down to size with his tongue. And so then he writes this stuff, which is just difficult to penetrate. So you can read his things and you think, now, am I reading him right? Is this what he intended? But it can be understood these ways. And so, but obviously for him, the intent was to really dig in and reveal, true Christianity. And then, of course, later these, post-war existentialists pick him up. Yeah. And it's, the whole thing is just it's just
odd. It's fascinating. And he, you see him in school, the way he fits, at least in the kind of secular undergraduate school that I went to. He's not categorizable. He's not really a philosopher. The theologians don't own him or accept him. He's kind of literary, but he's not really that either. So who is he, and where does he fit? And so that's another fascinating thing about him.
Well, and that's a part of his shtick, in that, just as you described Fear and Trembling. So we can't, here's 3 ways we can't identify with Abraham, but we still can. And in fact, we must. And if you fail to identify with Abraham, well, you don't get it at all. Right. Even though he's just explained, well, here's 3 ways, you really can't.
Right.
And so then you have to hold all of this in your mind. And so for certain groups of rationalists that look at this, that very much want to, for lack of a better, to right-brained insistence on the world, to have everything match up and to have there be no contradictions, they'll look at Kierkegaard and say, well, find some word to dismiss him with. But he doesn't go away.
Right. Right. I think, a thread that you've been talking about recently that I find that we can maybe touch on here is this concept of modernity, and how everybody's responding to modernity. Everybody's finding modernity as putting pressure on them, and they have to come up with a way in which they can frame their their self-identity in this this essentially hegemonic worldview that we all kind of emerge into. And I think that Kierkegaard was that kind of a figure. I think he emerged in the version of that was Hegel. And Hegel was saying, look, the system is going to play itself out in this way, the universality, this sense of subjectivity will have its antithesis in universality, or the other way around, and then we're going to have the synthesis, and then we're going to move beyond. And I think what Kierkegaard, and this was Hegel's version of how to rectify the modern, how to make sense out of the modern, the progression from kind of religious notions to the philosophical, which was his peak of the human, right? Religious notions, religious ideas, religious cultural facts are going to evolve essentially through this dialectical process into philosophy.
Right.
Probably he thought his philosophy, I assume. And Kierkegaard is really pushing back on that. That, I think, really the main thing he's pushing back on there, and is that. And the way he pushes back on it is by saying, you cannot move away from the subject. You cannot move away from subjectivity in particular. The individual will always be your view on the world. Subjectivity is always present, and it's incommensurable with, this would be to use Kierkegaard's words, incommensurable with the universal. And so you can logically work out some way that it synthesizes, but in your own experience, it doesn't. Yeah. And so that's where you come to some place where you will have you will have to come up with something more than just that worldview that's given to you by the culture, essentially.
Yeah, and it's I mean it's easy to have this conversation kind of at this level up here in the abstract, but again, as the Bible does so well, with a story like Abraham. So I've been for the last few days, I mean, sometimes videos come easy for me, sometimes videos don't, and I've been trying to piece together a bunch of different things, and I've lately gotten caught in Frank Schaeffer's memoir, Crazy for God, and I've been reading that, and I've been so enjoying it, and because of all the, I mean, there were a number of people when I mentioned Frank Schaeffer in either a tweet or a blog or a video, a number of people, he's really hated in some groups because of how he talked about his parents, and his parents are beloved saints for some other groups. But this, what I really enjoy about the book is in some ways Abraham's challenge of sacrificing his son. Because at a certain level, every parent must face Abraham's challenge. And if you read, what Francis and Edith Schaeffer, and their children, and this strange, rather tight, judgmental, at least according to Frank, world that Edith Schaeffer had, Francis Schaeffer, different world again, and then you send your children out into this world, and this world will kill them. And in many ways, those who wish to keep their children from the world, well, that doesn't quite work. And so in a sense, you have to give them over to the world. And, there are plenty of sad stories of bad things happening. And so here, Abraham parenting, can we identify with him? Well, yes and no.
And the other part of Fear and Trembling is the working out of those options. That is to say, what would we think of Abraham if, so let's say, what would we think of Abraham if he had failed, if he had just turned around, if he had just gone up there, he saw the ram, he pulls the ram aside, he sacrifices the ram, and down he comes. That's one of the scenarios that Kierkegaard talks about. And that wouldn't, what would that have meant? Well, it would have meant that Abraham just disregarded God's command. And that would mean would mean that he's living in an entirely different world, that he is an entirely different consciousness of himself, and we would have a different consciousness of him, and it wouldn't be what we want. And that's what's so elevated about Abraham for Kierkegaard, is that he does go. I mean, he's walking quietly. I mean, he points out in the book that the way the story is so short. I mean, it's like a paragraph and a half. And one of the lines in there is, "Go to this mountain that is 3 days away." Why 3 days? Why not right next door? Well, it's because there's this 3-day walk that he has to do. And he's not even knowing where he's going, because he says, "And then I will point to you where you should go, what mountain you should go on." So there's this setup of the point of it is what is going on in Abraham's head, and that he can do this is, it's this thing we can't quite get our hands on, but it's what we know we have to do ourselves. That is to say, we have to move into the future and have faith in that future.
Yes.
And with, frankly, not a lot of good reason to have that faith. And that's what's in there.
And that's another bit of, Peter Boghossian wrote a book a number of years ago, A Manual for Creating Atheists, and Peter and I have chatted a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter, of course, is in his own hot water over all kinds of other things, of which he's now found allies in Christians. But he wrote this book which basically said that, faith is believing things for insufficient reasons. And I listened to that, and it's like, on one hand, that's kind of a dismissive definition of faith, but on the other hand, there's a little bit of truth to that. The difficulty is that the rationalists don't have all the reasons they think they have, that their security, and this is part of Kierkegaard, your security is not what you think it is. Yeah. And so one of the early things that I read when I was in seminary years ago is one of our Old Testament professors gave us a copy of the chapter from Erich Auerbach's Mimesis on Old Testament literature. And that it's just a chapter in the larger book Mimesis, but it is a masterpiece in showing exactly what you described, that this ancient text, in hardly any words, sets this thing up like this, which to me has always afforded these scribes who wrote the Old Testament were just masters. Again, it's every layer, and as children, we read through this stuff and, okay, 3 days away, blah 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 blah. No, you don't understand. This is everything up until this, and you're so right. So, and for me as a pastor, I love preaching through the book of Genesis. It's one of my favorite books. And sometimes people in my church get a little annoyed the way I address this, because they want, in a sense, a Hebrews 11 version of Abraham, where Abraham is a hero of faith. Yes, that's Hebrews 11. That's exactly right. But don't just read Hebrews 11 without reading Genesis. Yes. Because the story of Abraham is that God says, at age 75, I'm going to make you a great nation. And Abraham's like, this is the best thing a 75-year-old wandering Aramean could ever hear, because his wife is barren, and so then most of the story of Abraham is his faithlessness, because finding every which way to secure for himself what God has promised, and at every step God comes in and says, no. You have to believe You have to believe what I'm going to do for you. And then, of course, Isaac is kind of a weak character in the overall narrative, but you get to Jacob, and all of the same, now with Jacob and a little bit of a different twist. One of these things I think I should spend some time doing is treating some of Jordan Peterson's stuff on Jacob, because he doesn't actually, I think, illuminate who of us could illuminate everything in these texts, but illuminate so much of what is in these texts, which is this tension between, so, Jacob goes to Bethel and he's running away from his brother, and he lays down to sleep, and he has this vision of the stairs. Angels are coming and going, and God lays on Jacob the promise that he had given to his grandfather Abraham and says, I will bless you. And Jacob gets up and says, great, if you bless me, I'll give you 10%. And it's like, I mean, it is the opposite of faith.
Yeah.
And yet God does not abandon Jacob. In fact, he keeps, like, go to Laban. Okay, Jacob, you want to learn about cutting deals? You want to be the master of the deal? Meet Uncle Laban. You're going to learn a thing or two. And
it's fascinating. And another thing that's fascinating about that, and you mentioned the scribes, is that they left all this in there. I mean, what were they thinking?
Yes.
If you think about, and I don't know if I'm exactly right about this, but if you think about the Homeric epics, and one of the things about the Homeric epics is that they are very clean. They're very well worked.
Right.
I mean, they're worked from the beginning to the end, and they are gorgeous. And every line, and it's, the poetry is all lined up, and you can tell that probably over many generations, people were modifying and changing it in order to make it beautiful in that way.
That's right.
And that's a glorious thing. That's something that is a gift to us to have. So why didn't they do this with the Bible? I mean, they left this very questionable stuff in there, and they not just left it in there, they honored it. They carried it, carefully from one copy to the next, from one generation to the next. And it's just fascinating. That's a fascinating thing just in and of itself.
Yeah. And then we had 100 years of scholars looking at that and saying, oh, they didn't know what they were doing.
They're doing, right.
So here we're going to fix it. And then, of course, you have Robert Alter coming later saying, no, what? You don't know their mastery. They did this on purpose. And it's almost as if they understand what the life of faith is about, what it means to believe in this God, and what it means to walk with him. And it isn't this shallow, two-dimensional, facile thing that gets caricatured by Sam Harris.
There would have been so many moments where there would have been huge incentives to just rewrite that. I mean, let's just come on, just toss that and let's do this. Let's make it look better for us now. And yet they carried it forward. I find that to be fascinating.
Yeah, and actually Mimesis, I'll put the link to this. I'm taking better notes with these conversations now, and I might do some other things. But Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, that chapter on biblical narrative, because he compares it with Homer, and he makes exactly the same.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
He says, you look at Homer and it's flat. It's, the characters are, there it is. But you read the Bible and it's so compressed and it's so refined. And even just Genesis chapter 22, take your son, your only son. I mean,
that's right.
So
the one that you love.
The one that you love. and just point by point by point, raising this tension, and then suddenly, and this to me is why the Bible works. And when I say the Bible works, I mean, why is this book, out of all of the ancient books we have in the world, why has this book continued to transform the world? And it does. It's continuing to transform it in Africa and in Asia right now. In amazing ways that we don't know, but there it is. So
okay, here's a what'll sound like a non sequitur, or maybe not, I don't know what. So the movie Free Solo, did you watch that movie?
That's
Okay,
that's
so
that's the guy who
Alex Honnold climbed El Cap. I used to be a climber when I was younger. And
really.
so well, in fact, I talked to my brother, who was my partner, about going to see the movie. And he basically said he wouldn't go see it because we had climbed together. It was like, this is just too much tension. I mean, it's too much tension. And, but here's my thought on this, and relating this to Fear and Trembling, because I think the structure of that film is very kind of analogous to the what Fear and Trembling is doing. So 80% of that film is building up to the moment where he is going to climb that rock. And he's going to climb it, as if people don't know, he's going to climb it without protection of any kind. And obviously any slip is a certain death. And that's the whole notion of doing free solo climbing. And the build up to this is the building up of the tension of this thing, because he's practicing it, and they're showing him practicing it, and they're showing him reach, for example, one crux move, which is about more than 3/4 of the way up. And this is a tough move for him, and he practices it and misses it repeatedly. And so he gets it kind of, and now he feels like he's gonna do this thing, and he finds himself at the base of the rock, and he's going to go up. And that's kind of a pivotal moment in the film. But there's a thing about this that's very much like looking at Abraham, right? I mean, there's no sense in what he's about to do. That is a completely irrational thing that he's about to do. Even for me, a guy who has a sensitivity for this and have, wanting to do something like that as a climber when I was younger, I never would have even come close to that kind of thing. But you cannot do this. This is not reasonable. And they build it up in a way where he's got this girlfriend, and his life has kind of turned into something more meaningful than maybe it had been before. And there's lots of reasons why maybe he should make a different decision. And so, but we're looking on Alex Honnold in the same way that we're looking on Abraham, because there's these buddies of his who are going to do this filming. The filmmakers are part of the film. And they're also climbers, so they know him. They're friends, and there's a scene in there where he takes off, and there's this one cameraman who's pointing the camera up there, and he cannot look. He cannot watch this guy go up this climb.
Yeah.
And he gets to this crux moment, and he pulls it off, of course, and he gets to the top. And the odd thing there's a lot of odd things about it, but the odd thing about it is that you get very gripped. This is a gripping film. And yet how this film ends, right? You know that he gets to the top. And in fact, the way Alex Honnold is the person he is because he makes it to the top. He would have been something entirely different had he fallen, or had he gone and decided against it. He would have been maybe close to a nobody, or not quite nobody, but it would have been written very differently. He wouldn't have been the heroic figure that we see him to be. And that's all about the fact that we know, or that he ends up pulling it off. And it's got a similar feel in my mind to that we feel that gripped nature of that moment and that experience as he kind of climbs up there and essentially kind of touches the face of God for us. And then we realize, if we're sensitive to this, that's what we're doing. That's what we do in our lives. We're going off into the next thing. We're choosing to try to do this career or that career, meet or marry this person and not that person. Our lives are, they have these kinds of stakes, if you will. And I just thought that was a fascinating way of looking at that film.
I hadn't thought of that at all, but I think that is so true. And I love the way you noted that he would have been something entirely different if he had fallen or if he hadn't climbed. That is so true. And what I thought of when, because you set it up well, and I very much recommend the movie. Yeah, spoiler alert, he doesn't fall. But it's an astounding film, and of course I've been to Yosemite is one of my favorite places on earth. It's about 3.5 hours south of us. And so I go there, a few times a year, every year. And when you drive into that valley and you look up at El Capitan, or if you say go in the summer, you go up to Glacier Point, you look down into the valley, you get a sense of perspective of what this is. And you realize what this guy does. The thing that I thought of at the end of the movie was, when does he stop? Okay, he's done El Capitan.
Right.
Do it again. Well, doing it again, if you do it again, you're going to want to take a different route, right?
Right. Oh, make it harder and harder.
Right.
The end point is not,
the end point is
death.
And I think that for me, that then brings this, connects it in a sense into Christ, because, I often tell my congregation, none of us gets out of this alive.
Right.
That is our story. Now, the question will be, how will we live?
Right.
And I think, looking at it, say, through the lens of him, he is, and you very much have the sense of this in this film. This film is very honest about his friends, like you said, his friends, and that just blew me away. These other, second tier climbers who are just up there to take. It's
great. It's an incredible film. It's an incredible film.
You're just there to take pictures. You're just there to get video of this guy doing this.
Yeah.
It's like, but he is going to do this until he either stops or falls.
Right.
How do you manage that?
Right. How do you manage it? Well, I would say this.
Here's one thing.
Yeah. I would go, this is, I thought that there was an interesting moment at the top where he was delighted or whatever. I think he said, I'm delighted at this or something. And you realize there's a little bit of a sadness or a little bit of like, it's over. The moment of touching the face of God was very thin. It was a very instantaneous moment for him. And you can almost see it while he gets past that crux. He looks into the camera with a big smile after he, gets himself secure after that crux. And you realize, this project that he's on is going to be like that. And here's the question that I would ask of it. And here's the question that I would ask of it. And that is, what would be more heroic and what would be more, let's say, Christ-like? To go to the base of the crime, all the cameras are on him. And what does he do? He turns around and he says, no, I'm not going to do this. Yeah. And he goes back to that girl and he gets married and he has a family and he raises that family and he lives with the Isaac that he sacrificed, which was to be that guy who climbed that rock. And instead he gets the gift of a life. But you have to make that sacrifice. That is to say, you have to choose that. You have to choose not to go up on there. And that's a criticism of Kierkegaard. I mean, and it's if you read the criticisms of Kierkegaard, it's like leap of faith. This is crazy. He's an irrationalist. I've kind of gotten past that in this way. And I think that that's the right choice for Hanel to make, right? Is to see it as more heroic. To see that, to see what glory he could have, both in his own ecstatic experience of it, but also in, in the way he would be viewed and the future that he would have if he climbs that and he's an Oscar winner and all that, to see all of that and yet choose not to do it.
It's, I two thoughts on that. One is, of course, the novel, The Last Temptation of Christ, where you play with, and of course, the biblical narrative. So here you have Jesus, and there's people going to believe or disbelieve this, whatever. But here you have Jesus who has the kind of power to still a storm, has the kind of power to turn water into wine, has the kind of power to say, here I am in the Gospel of John, and the soldiers fall back, has the kind of power to call Lazarus from the tomb. Well, can nails and ropes on a cross hold him. And his mockers are saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. And so there you have the question that the Bible clearly sets up Jesus' crucifixion with this ambiguity of being a victim, and yet it also being voluntary. The Bible is clear about setting up that ambiguity in that story. So what then does that mean? You know, it's interesting. Peterson talks about this quite clearly in a number of places where he's getting into the psychology and the anatomy of meaning, and that meaning is about reaching. It isn't finally about attaining. And that comes through so clearly in that film that he gets to the top.
And it's like, there's a real letdown there. And you notice it. You see it in his eyes that it's like, oh, I want to be back there down on the rock.
Yep.
But all he was doing down on the rock was trying to get up to the dock, you know. All right. So here's another one. Yep. Another film, which is going to line up, I think, pretty well with this. Stranger Than Fiction. Did you ever see that film? Oh, gosh. I'm going to have to set this up. Will Ferrell, it's a kind of B, it's not quite a B movie, but it certainly wasn't a big budget deal, but it has some great people in it. Dustin Hoffman, Emma Thompson, Queen Latifah is in it. And I'll set the story up for you. There's this guy who's kind of living by the law. He's a tax collector, and he's really kind of got nothing going on in his life except he's counting beans, and he's following all the rules, and he something weird happens to him where he hears this voice in his head, which is basically narrating his life. And that turns out to be Emma Thompson writing a novel about his life. And she basically is writing his story. And through some freakish deal, he's hearing that narration as it's going on. This is kind of a comic movie. It is not high level, but it's very well done, I think. And so he does not believe that he's insane. He believes this voice. He believes the voice is telling him the truth. And parallel to this is this love interest moment for him, where he starts to break out of his rule-based life, and he realizes there's something more there, and he develops that relationship to the point where now he's got a really full life, or a lot of potential in that life. But in the meantime, Emma Thompson is basically telling him that he's going to die. And it turns out that Emma Thompson is also in the film, and she's a novelist, and she's got a spiel, kind of like the murder mystery person who does the A, B, C, D, E. But her deal is that she writes these novels about people, and the pivotal point or the peak of the novel is how they die. So all of the characters die in some special way in the way that she does these novels. And so she's kind of locked into this idea of writing out this guy's death. And in the meantime, he's hearing the story. So that comes to the point where he realized, I got to figure this out because I've got this life I want to save. She's telling me I'm going to die. He believes it. So he goes to Dustin Hoffman, and bottom line is he finds out who she is, and he goes to her. And he confronts her and says, you can't kill me. And she, right at this moment, she had figured out how she was going to kill him and finished the novel. But we don't realize that at that moment. And other characters have been introduced, but he goes to Dustin Hoffman, who's this literary critic, and basically he reads the book complete and says he's got to accept that what's going to happen, that he's going to die. And he says, what are you talking about? I can't accept what's going to happen. So finally he gets convinced to read the novel. And he reads the novel, and he kind of in this siege kind of deal where he reads it. And there's then another scene where he finally goes back to Emma Thompson with a totally different affect. And he says, this is how it has to be. I accept it. That you can't change the novel. This is the way it's going to happen. And then the next scene is that he had repeatedly come to this bus stop during the film. And in a snap decision, there's a young child pulls in front of the bus, and he saves the kid and gets killed in the process. And so he had basically he was aware of the story. He was aware of what was required of him, and he accepted that. And it's it's a very touching movie, and very, I think, has a really profound sense to it, even though it's got this light feel to it. And then, of course, Emma Thompson talks to Dustin Hoffman, and she can't go through with it. And so he actually doesn't die. He is saved. He's resurrected.
It's an American movie.
It is an American movie, but it's a resurrection story. I mean, this has got a real kind of I think it's got a sleeper Christian thing to it, and it's very touching. And anyway, it goes to this same idea of there is a meaningful thing there that might actually ask for self-sacrifice, and you might actually consciously choose that as the right thing to do. And in a much more kind of serious way than we were talking about with Hanel, choosing not to go for the rock. I mean, and I don't know, that's a very meaningful movie for me that way. Even though it's this kind of small film, it really encapsulates
Well, I'm definitely going to watch it now. I mean, part of the beauty of Amazon and Netflix is that you pretty much watch anything on demand these days. That's, that I've been in my alternate universe and with my pastor hat on, we have denominational synod, which is discussing things, and I discuss with church people various things. One of the recurrent topics of conversation, not only in my church circles but also in my meetup circles, is this question of marriage. And marriage, it isn't a secret that marriage is in many ways in trouble, and it's not in trouble in that people are no longer getting married. In fact, I'm performing a wedding this weekend. But it's in trouble in that the sense of marriage itself is a willing sacrifice. And unless both people are willing to sacrifice in the marriage, it doesn't work. Yeah. And it doesn't work for the children, and it doesn't work for broader society. And we have a society which seems in increasing measure unable to embrace these kinds of sacrifices that are common. They're so common, and they so often seem so pointless. You look at the parent of the disabled child. You look at the spouse of the person suffering from Alzheimer's. You look at, and so as a pastor, in the church, so often you watch people walk through years of suffering faithfulness, and people look at it and say, to what end? They don't even recognize their spouse yet, but there's something of this, there's
and it's happening all the time. Yeah. And to all of us.
Yes.
And the fact is, we can be that heroic person, and we must be that heroic person. Right. And many of us fail to be that heroic person.
That's right.
And so it's that is real, and that's where the Abraham story really is so true, because it's not just a sacrifice of something that I could have given up anyway. This is a real McCoy thing, and that's why that story is so poignant or so correct. Because you're absolutely right. The later on in marriage, you say, "Oh, you mean I have to sacrifice that? I said I would sacrifice, but I didn't know you meant that." And yes. I did mean that.
And with a child.
Exactly.
And with a parent.
Exactly. This is the mode of life. This is what we are and what we do. And I see it all the time as a physician. It is common heroics all the time. And most people, a lot of people, live up to that challenge in ways that are profound.
Yeah. And anonymously. They were, I mean, you will, I mean, so I just did a conversation with my friend Rod Hugan, who my friend, he's such a master storyteller, and he's so able to tell these stories because, you know, physicians, doctors, nurses, pastors, I mean, we see this because we get up close to common people, and when you see this kind of heroism and sacrifice, it humbles you. And the thing is, we also see the ones who
choose something else,
cut and run.
That's right.
And we watch that, and we watch what comes on generationally after that.
Because of that. Absolutely.
Because of that.
Yeah.
And so then you say, well, I think it's, yeah, we're back to Kierkegaard and Fear and Trembling.
That's right.
Either way you cut it.
Yeah.
Are you going to take the hit? Are you going to sacrifice? Are you going to spend years of your life doing something that much of the world would look at and say, yeah, I suppose it has to be done, but it's really pointless.
Yeah.
And
there it is. It's Alex Honnold standing at the base of the rock. We say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. That's so ridiculous. That kind of move is so ridiculous. That's too out of bounds. Well, that's really not true, because if you're going to end up being alone with a patient who's getting worse with dementia, and you are going to stick by their side no matter what, that's that kind of sacrifice. And, you know, so it's, and I love that conversation. And I think you have this great way of balancing, you know, your conversation about Kierkegaard and the other ones that you did. They're kind of elevated, and there's a lot of ideas involved, and those are important and interesting, but there's nothing more than that story that he told that has to be said.
That's right. And everyone gets it.
Yes.
You know, where, you know, Kierkegaard is enormously hard to read.
Right.
Most people
Exactly.
won't read them. And we're
That's
reading
right.
them in translation. How many of us speak Danish?
Yeah.
So, but here you find the saints among us.
Absolutely.
Doing, and as a pastor, you bump into them sometimes, and you just meet them on the street and you don't know. Then you get a window into their lives, and it's like, oh,
yeah.
What are they suffering?
Yeah.
What are they carrying?
Yeah. And to notice that is sacramental. To notice that is what we should be doing more. I mean, we're noticing and honoring and emulating that is what the project is really.
Yeah. Well, our time has flown.
All right. Very good.
But this has been a delight.
I love these conversations.
Thank you so much.
Maybe we'll do it again. Hey, thanks, Paul.
All right.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.